The message reached every world at the exact same second. It did not arrive through diplomatic channels or the slow ceremonial systems the galaxy preferred. It came like a verdict already decided. No warning, no preamble, no room for negotiation. A single transmission, stamped with the authority of the Galactic Conclave, broadcast across every human colony, every station, every ship in transit. Humanity is hereby expelled. There were no riots, no emergency sirens, no desperate calls to arms. Across Earth, people paused, just for a moment. A woman in a crowded market lowered a piece of fruit back onto the stall. A cargo pilot hovering above Mars rechecked his instruments, thinking it was a glitch. A teacher on Luna stopped mid-sentence, her students staring at the frozen screen behind her. And then everything continued, quietly, deliberately, as if the message had changed nothing at all. 12 minutes later, the conclave realized something was wrong. The second transmission never came. There was no human response, no formal protest, no attempt to appeal the decision. Nothing. Inside the conclave hall on Virex Prime, 12 species waited in growing irritation. This was not how this moment was supposed to unfold. For 3 centuries, humanity had been manageable, difficult at times, expansive, curious, annoyingly adaptive, but ultimately predictable. They negotiated, they compromised, they complied. They always complied. The high speaker leaned forward, long fingers steepled beneath a narrow, patient face. "Open a direct channel," he said. A technician hesitated. "There is no active response channel, speaker." The pause. "Then initiate one." The technician's hands moved quickly across the console. Signals were sent, frequencies aligned, protocols overridden. The connection formed, for exactly 3 seconds. Then it closed. Not interrupted. Not jammed. Closed from the other side. A ripple moved through the chamber. That had never happened before, not in the entire recorded history of the conclave. "Try again." They did. Different frequencies. Different relays. Even deep-band emergency channels reserved for extinction-level events. Each one connected. Each one closed. On the 12th attempt, something new happened. The channel stayed open, but no one spoke. There was only a single human figure on the screen, standing in what appeared to be a dimly lit command room. No insignia. No visible rank. Just stillness watching them. The high speaker straightened. "You have received the ruling," he said, voice smooth and absolute. "You are expected to acknowledge compliance." The human didn't respond immediately. Didn't argue. Didn't plead. Didn't even blink. And then he smiled. Not widely, not mockingly, just knowingly. "We received it," he said, his voice calm, too calm, measured in a way that felt deliberate. The high speaker's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then you understand your position." A small pause stretched just long enough to feel intentional. "No," the human said. Then, softer, "I don't think you do." Before the conclave could respond, the feed cut. Across human space, the same thing happened at the same time. Every outbound communication array went silent. Every diplomatic channel closed. Every external relay powered down. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Shut off. Like a door being locked from the inside. And for the first time in 300 years, the galaxy had no way to reach humanity at all. For 300 years, humanity had been the smallest voice in every room that mattered. Not the weakest, never that, but the most carefully contained. The elder species of the Galactic Conclave had learned early that humans were not dangerous in the way others were. They did not dominate through force, did not conquer through fleets or burn worlds into submission. What made them unsettling was something quieter. They adapted too quickly. They asked too many questions. They moved too fast for a civilization that had only just stepped into interstellar space. So the Conclave did what it had always done with emerging species that showed too much potential too early. It set boundaries. Humans were granted access to shared space, but only along approved corridors. They were permitted trade, but only within regulated limits. They were allowed to study advanced sciences, but entire fields were quietly marked as restricted. Certain propulsion systems were deemed destabilizing. Certain branches of artificial cognition were labeled ethically premature. Lifespan extension research was discouraged under the justification of resource balance. Expansion beyond assigned sectors required unanimous approval, which was never given. And humanity agreed to all of it. That was what made them acceptable. They signed every treaty. They attended every summit. They followed every protocol with a precision that bordered on perfection. When corrected, they adjusted. When restricted, they complied. When warned, they stepped back. Over time, a pattern formed: reliable, predictable, safe. The conclave came to believe it understood them. A young species eager for approval. Ambitious but ultimately dependent. Intelligent but not yet mature enough to stand alone. They were seen as useful builders, efficient problem solvers, a civilization that could be guided, shaped, and, when necessary, limited. There had been small incidents, of course. Human ships that reached the edge of restricted zones before turning back. Research proposals that pushed just close enough to forbidden lines to raise concern. Unusual collaborations with minor client species that technically did not violate any agreements but made certain council members uncomfortable. Each time, the response was the same. A warning. A reminder. A reinforcement of boundaries. And each time, humanity stepped back. Always just enough. Never more. To the conclave, it looked like restraint. To those who were paying closer attention, it might have looked like measurement. Because while the conclave believed it was containing humanity, humanity was learning the exact shape of the cage. Every denied request revealed a limit. Every restriction defined a boundary. Every law, every clause, every carefully worded prohibition added another line to a map that only humans seemed interested in completing. They listened when the conclave spoke. They recorded everything. They adapted not just to the rules, but to the intent behind them. And then they became very, very quiet. Human expansion slowed. Their proposals became more conservative. Their presence in contested regions diminished. Even their political representatives changed tone, less argumentative, more agreeable. Over decades, then centuries, the tension faded. The conclave stopped watching them as closely. There were larger threats to manage, older rivalries to balance, more immediate crises to resolve. Humanity became background. Reliable. Stable. Under control. That assumption held for a long time. Until the day it didn't. Because what the conclave had interpreted as obedience was never obedience at all. It was patience. Not the passive kind, not the kind born from weakness or fear, but something deliberate. Calculated. The kind of patience that studies a system until it understands not just how it works, but how it can be moved. And by the time the conclave finally decided to remove humanity from the equation, it believed it was dealing with a problem that had grown inconvenient. It did not realize it was triggering something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The first internal directive did not come from a government. It did not come from a military command or a council vote or any public authority that the conclave had spent centuries monitoring. It came from somewhere else, a channel so quiet it didn't officially exist, and yet within minutes of the expulsion order it reached every critical node in human space. There was no broadcast, no announcement, no visible chain of command, just a simple instruction delivered simultaneously to ship captains, infrastructure coordinators, research directors, and systems engineers across dozens of worlds. Stand by, await phase shift confirmation, do not respond externally. To the outside galaxy, humanity had gone silent. To itself, it had become perfectly synchronized. On Earth, deep beneath a research complex that had never appeared on any conclave registry, a woman in her 70s stood in front of a wall of inactive displays. Her name was Dr. Ilara Voss, though very few people outside a small, carefully selected circle still used it. For most of her life, she had built systems that were never meant to be seen, systems designed not for immediate use but for a future that had not yet been allowed to exist. She had been waiting for this message. When it arrived, she did not react with surprise. She nodded once, as if confirming something long expected, and placed her hand against the console in front of her. "Finally," she said quietly, Around her, the dark screens came alive. Not all at once, not dramatically, one by one, like a sequence being followed with absolute precision. Hidden networks woke from dormancy, sealed archives unlocked, and projects that had existed only in fragments across isolated systems began reconnecting, assembling themselves into something whole. Elsewhere, the same thing was happening. On Mars, a manufacturing director received the directive and immediately halted all outgoing shipments to non-human sectors. No explanation was given, none was needed. Within minutes, production lines began shifting priorities, reconfiguring output toward internal logistics. In orbit around Jupiter, a communications engineer rerouted a relay array that had spent decades handling external traffic. The system did not shut down. It turned inward, linking human networks together with a bandwidth they had never openly used before. On a distant colony at the edge of approved space, a survey team received the same instruction, packed their equipment, sealed their data, and began preparing for departure without notifying any neighboring systems. There was no panic, no confusion, only alignment. What made it strange, what made it different from any coordinated response the Conclave had ever seen, was the absence of escalation. There were no emergency alerts, no mobilization orders, no visible signs of crisis. If anything, human activity appeared to become calmer, more precise, as if every individual suddenly understood exactly what needed to be done without being told why. Hours after the initial transmission, a second message moved through the same hidden channel, shorter this time, clear. Phase 1 confirmed, begin transition. Dr. Voss watched the confirmation scroll across her display. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached for a secure line, one that connected to only a handful of individuals across human space. When the connection opened, she spoke a single sentence. "We're no longer waiting." The response came almost instantly. Understood. Across dozens of worlds, systems that had been built quietly, patiently, over generations began shifting into a new state, not activating, not yet, but preparing, like mechanisms that had spent years in stillness now aligning for motion. If anyone within the Conclave had been able to see what was happening beneath the surface, they might have recognized the pattern. Not resistance, not retreat, something else, something far more controlled. But the Conclave couldn't see it, because every window they had ever used to observe humanity had just been closed. And for the first time since entering the galaxy, humanity was no longer reacting to events. It was moving according to its own. The facility did not exist on any map the Conclave had ever seen. It was not hidden in the sense of being cloaked or shielded. It was hidden because no one had ever been told to look for it. Buried beneath layers of ordinary infrastructure on Earth, mirrored in smaller forms across Mars, Luna, and a dozen outer installations, it had been built slowly, quietly, and with a level of patience that only made sense in hindsight. Dr. Ilara Voss walked through the central corridor as systems came online around her. The air carried a low, steady hum, the sound of dormant machinery waking after a long and deliberate sleep. Engineers were already at their stations, not rushing, not scrambling, but moving with the calm efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment more times than they could count. No one asked what was happening. They already knew enough. A young technician glanced up from his console as Voss passed. "All sections reporting active," he said. "Synchronization across off-world nodes is holding." "Of course it is," she replied. "It was designed to." He hesitated, then asked the question he had been holding back. "Is this really it?" Voss didn't slow down. "No," she said. "This is just the part we're allowed to see." She reached the end of the corridor and stepped into a wide chamber lined with transparent panels. Behind each one, systems that had never been publicly acknowledged began to stabilize into visible form. Not prototypes, not experimental rigs. Finished designs, refined over generations. Some were small enough to fit in a person's hand. Others filled entire rooms. All of them shared the same quiet detail. They were not new. They were complete. 300 years earlier, when humanity had first entered conclave space, the agreements had been celebrated as a victory. Access to established trade networks, shared knowledge archives, protected expansion corridors, it had looked like an open door. The restrictions had been presented as guidance, a framework to ensure stability, a way to prevent a young species from making dangerous mistakes. Humanity had accepted every condition. Publicly. What never appeared in any official record was what happened after those agreements were signed. Not defiance, not rebellion, something far more subtle. The projects that were restricted did not stop. They moved. Research that could not continue in open institutions was transferred into private networks, then into classified ones, and eventually into places like this. Each time the conclave drew a line, humans marked it, studied it, and then continued just out of sight. The first generation had called it caution. The second called it necessity. By the third, it had become policy. By the fourth, it was simply how things were done. In orbit around Saturn, inside a station that had never appeared on any shipping route, a man named Adrian Cade stood in front of a suspended engine core that bent light around its edges. He had spent his entire career working on propulsion systems that officially did not exist. When the conclave banned spatial folding research, the project had not ended. It had been divided, distributed across multiple teams, each one working on a fragment that made no sense on its own. Only in places like this had those fragments ever been brought together. Now, for the first time, the system was whole. Containment field stable, one of his engineers reported. No external signatures. Cade allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. There wouldn't be, he said. They told us never to build it. They never told us not to understand it. On Luna, beneath a medical complex known only for routine treatments, another team brought a different system online. Where conclave doctrine had discouraged lifespan extension, citing resource strain and societal imbalance, human researchers had continued the work in isolation. Not recklessly, not in uncontrolled bursts, but carefully, methodically, refining each stage over decades. The result was not a miracle device or a single breakthrough. It was a system, layered, redundant, and complete. Cells that repaired themselves more efficiently. Organs that could be replaced without rejection. Neural degradation slowed to the point of near irrelevance. It had never been deployed at scale. Not because it didn't work, because the time had not yet come. Deep in a data vault beneath Mars, something else stirred. It did not resemble machinery in the conventional sense. There were no moving parts, no visible interfaces, only a lattice of light patterns shifting within a contained field. For centuries, the conclave had restricted the development of advanced artificial cognition, drawing a hard line at systems capable of independent evolution. Humanity had acknowledged that line, then stepped around it. The first versions had been simple, deliberately limited. The next were more complex, but isolated. Over time, a framework emerged, one that allowed growth without immediate exposure, learning without external influence. It had been refined, iteration after iteration, until the distinction between program and presence became harder to define. Now, as the containment protocols adjusted, the system responded. Not with a command, with awareness. Across all these locations, across every hidden project and every sealed archive, the same realization surfaced at the same time. Nothing that was activating now had been created in response to the expulsion. None of it was new. It had all been built long before. The conclave had believed it was guiding a young species, shaping its development, keeping it within safe limits. In reality, it had been outlining the exact boundaries within which humanity could operate unnoticed. Every restriction had narrowed the field of observation. Every prohibition had pushed human progress into spaces that were never monitored. What the conclave saw was compliance. What actually existed was parallel advancement. Back on Earth, Dr. Voss stood at the center of the chamber as the final systems came online. Data streams stabilized, connections locked into place, and for the first time in 3 centuries, every hidden network was fully linked. A technician approached her, voice steady but quieter than before. All sectors are active. No external detection. Ready. Voss looked across the room, at the systems that represented generations of work carried out in silence. Then she nodded once. Good, she said. Then we can finally stop pretending. And in that moment, across human space, The truth became simple. Humanity had not been restricted. It had been preparing. The question had been asked many times across the hidden network, though rarely out loud and never in any official record. If humanity had possessed the capability to bypass the Conclave's restrictions for so long, why had it chosen not to? Why wait centuries instead of stepping forward the moment it was able? The answer was not simple, but it was consistent. Because timing mattered more than power. Because being right was less important than being unchallenged. And because a system that believes it controls you is far easier to study than one that sees you as a threat. In a secure briefing chamber beneath Luna, a small group of coordinators reviewed data that had been collected over generations. Not intelligence in the traditional sense, not espionage or intercepted transmissions, but something more structural. Patterns of decision-making within the Conclave, response times to perceived violations, thresholds for intervention, dependencies between member species, logistical reliance on shared infrastructure. It was not a map of territory. It was a map of behavior. Every restriction the Conclave had ever imposed had been recorded alongside the reaction it produced. Every enforcement action had been measured not just for outcome, but for intent. Over time, a model emerged. One that predicted not just what the Conclave would do, but when it would decide to do it. The conclusion had been reached long before the present moment. If humanity had openly defied the Conclave at any point during those early centuries, the response would have been immediate and overwhelming. Not because of fear, but because of precedent. The Conclave maintained order by ensuring that no emerging species could disrupt the balance before it fully understood the system it was entering. Open resistance would have triggered containment. Containment would have escalated into suppression. Humanity would not have survived that phase intact. So it didn't resist. Not openly. Instead, it did something far more effective. It complied where it was being watched and continued where it was not. It allowed the Conclave to believe its framework was working, that its rules were being respected, that its authority was unquestioned. In doing so, it removed itself from the list of active concerns. Other species drew attention through conflict, expansion, or instability. Humanity became the opposite, stable, cooperative, predictable. Invisible in the ways that mattered. Over time, this produced a secondary effect that had never been part of the Conclave's design. The more humanity complied, the less closely it was observed. Monitoring resources were allocated elsewhere. Audits became less frequent. Inspections shifted from thorough to routine. The assumption of control replaced the need for verification. And in that space, unobserved and unchallenged, the real work continued. There was another reason, one that had nothing to do with external systems and everything to do with humanity itself. Rushing would have been inefficient. The technologies being developed in the hidden networks were not single breakthroughs. They were ecosystems of interdependent systems, each requiring stability before the next could be built on top of it. Advancing one area too quickly without the others would have created imbalance, risk, and potential failure at scale. The Conclave's restrictions, while limiting on the surface, had inadvertently provided something useful: time. Time to refine. Time to test. Time to ensure that when these systems were finally brought together, they would not just function, they would endure. Dr. Voss had once summarized it in a private session decades earlier, speaking to a group of engineers who had grown impatient with the pace of progress. If you reveal a capability too early, she had said, you don't get to decide how it's used. You don't get to decide who controls it. You don't even get to decide if it survives first contact with the systems around it. You become part of someone else's equation. She had paused, letting the implication settle. We're not building tools, she continued. We're building a position. And a position only matters if you can hold it. By the time the Conclave issued its expulsion order, that position was already secured. Every major dependency had been mapped. Every critical system had an internal alternative. Supply chains that once relied on shared infrastructure had been quietly duplicated within human-controlled networks. Communication relays had parallel pathways. Energy distribution systems had redundancies that did not appear in any external registry. Even the colonies established within Conclave space had been designed with one assumption in mind: They might one day need to leave everything behind. Or take everything with them. Back on Earth, Voss stood with a small group of senior coordinators as status reports flowed in from across human space. No anomalies. No resistance. No unexpected variables. The transition was proceeding exactly as modeled. One of the younger analysts, reviewing the data, looked up with a question that had clearly been forming for some time. "They think they're forcing us out," he said. "They think this is a punishment." Voss considered that for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Of course they do," she replied. "And they don't see what this actually is?" "No," she said. "They don't." The analyst hesitated. "And what is it?" Voss turned back to the display, watching as another set of systems shifted from standby to active readiness. "It's release," she said. Across the network, the same understanding settled into place. Humanity had not been waiting because it was weak. It had been waiting because it was not yet finished. And now, for the first time in 300 years, nothing was holding it in place anymore. The official order from the Galactic Conclave had been precise in its wording. Humanity was to withdraw completely from all shared space within 400 standard days. Every ship, every citizen, every outpost, and every tool of human origin was to be removed. After that deadline, any remaining human presence would be treated as hostile. It was written as a punishment. Humanity read it as permission. The first movements began within hours of phase confirmation. Not loudly, not dramatically, but everywhere at once. Fleets that had spent decades operating trade routes quietly altered course. Civilian transports were reassigned under internal priority protocols. Long-range cargo vessels, some of the largest ever built, shifted from distribution to retrieval. From the outside, it appeared organized. From the inside, it was exact. Every human-controlled system already knew its role. In the Kepler corridor, a chain of colonies stretched across a thin band of conclave territory, home to millions of human settlers and decades of infrastructure. Commander Elias Wren stood on the bridge of his flagship as the first wave of transport ships entered orbit above the outermost world. The colony below was already in motion. No alarms, no confusion. Landing zones were clear, cargo manifests prepared, and population transfers scheduled down to the minute. A systems officer glanced over the incoming data. "Evacuation readiness at 98%, she said. "Local leadership requests confirmation on secondary extraction." Wren didn't hesitate. "Authorize it." She paused briefly. "Secondary extraction includes non-essential systems." "Everything is essential," he replied calmly. "If we built it, it comes with us." Across the colony, the meaning of that order became visible. Agricultural systems were dismantled with the same care they had been assembled. Climate regulators were powered down, disassembled, and loaded piece by piece into transport vessels. Power grids were not simply shut off. They were removed, their components cataloged and packed for relocation. Even structural elements designed to last centuries were taken apart methodically. Nothing was destroyed. Everything was reclaimed. 3 days into the operation, a conclave observer vessel entered orbit. Its presence was expected. It transmitted a standard inquiry, requesting clarification on the scale of the withdrawal. The channel opened on Wren's command deck, and the face of an Allery envoy appeared, composed but clearly unsettled. "Commander," the envoy said, "your removal procedures appear to exceed the requirements outlined in the ruling. Agricultural systems and environmental stabilizers were not explicitly included." Wren listened without interruption. When the envoy finished, he gave a small, polite nod. "The directive states that all tools of human origin are to be withdrawn," he said. "We are ensuring full compliance." The envoy held his gaze. "Those systems support the colony's continued viability." "They are human systems," Wren replied. "We are removing them." A brief silence followed. The envoy seemed to consider a response, then stopped. "Very well," he said at last. "Proceed." The channel closed. On the surface, the final transport lifted 12 days later. From orbit, the colony still looked intact. Structures remained. Roads stretched across the terrain. The outline of a functioning settlement was still there, but everything that made it function was gone. Within weeks, environmental conditions began to shift. Without climate regulation, temperature extremes returned. Without maintenance systems, power failures cascaded through the remaining grid. Crops failed. Water systems destabilized. The colony did not collapse immediately, but it began to decline in ways that could not be reversed without rebuilding everything that had been taken. And humanity was no longer there to do it. The same pattern repeated across every human presence in conclave space. 42 major colonies, hundreds of outposts, thousands of installations, each one dismantled with precision, each one left structurally intact but functionally empty. Infrastructure that the conclave had come to rely on, often without realizing its origin, disappeared piece by piece. Relay networks went dark. Trade routes slowed as navigation systems were removed. Energy distribution grids failed in regions that had quietly depended on human-built systems for decades. None of it violated the ruling. Every action was compliance. By the midpoint of the withdrawal period, the conclave began to understand the scale of what was happening. Internal communications shifted from routine oversight to urgent review. Reports from multiple sectors described the same pattern: declining system stability following human departure. Attempts to compensate revealed a deeper problem. Many of the systems being removed were not isolated additions. They were foundational layers, integrated so thoroughly that their absence disrupted everything built on top of them. The conclave had not realized how much of its infrastructure was human. Requests were sent, not demands but requests, clarifications, suggestions that certain systems be left in place for the sake of stability, appeals framed as mutual benefit. Humanity did not respond. On the 398th day, the final withdrawal was underway. The last human installation in conclave space, a long-range relay known as Ardent Spire, prepared for extraction. It had operated continuously for over 2 centuries, carrying communications across vast distances and linking sectors that would otherwise have remained isolated. Now it stood silent. Commander Wren watched from orbit as the final components were loaded aboard the last transport. The structure remained behind, a hollow framework drifting in the dark. A communications officer turned toward him. "Incoming hail," she said. "Conclave priority channel." Wren considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Put it through." The high speaker appeared on the display, older than before, his expression more measured. "Commander," he said, "humanity has fulfilled the terms of its withdrawal. The conclave acknowledges your thoroughness." Wren met his gaze. "We followed the directive exactly." The pause. "There are consequences to such interpretations," the speaker said carefully. Wren inclined his head slightly. "There always are." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Wren reached forward and closed the channel. 6 hours later, the final human vessel crossed the boundary of conclave space. No ships followed. No signals were exchanged. Behind them, a vast network of systems began to fail in slow, cascading sequences, not because they had been attacked, but because they had been understood. And for the first time, the conclave faced a problem it could not correct by issuing another order, because the ones who had built the system were gone. The return to human space was not celebrated. There were no broadcasts, no declarations of victory, no public ceremonies marking the completion of the withdrawal. The final fleets crossed the boundary in silence, their transponders active only on internal networks, their routes predetermined long before the conclave had ever issued its ruling. From the outside, it might have looked like retreat. From the inside, it was closure. Within hours of the last ship's arrival, a new sequence of instructions began to move through the network. These were not directives for evacuation or retrieval, those phases were complete. These were different, final, precise, and irreversible. All external gates were to prepare for shutdown. Across the human sphere, the gateways that had connected their systems to the wider galaxy began to shift into a new state. These structures had stood for generations, massive constructs anchored in stable points of space, linking distant regions through carefully maintained corridors. They were the arteries of interstellar civilization, not just for humanity, but for every species that had ever relied on them for travel, trade, and communication. Now they were being taken offline. Not abruptly, not destructively. Each gate entered a controlled sequence, its power levels reduced in calibrated stages, its internal geometry folding inward with mathematical precision. Engineers monitored every variable, ensuring that no residual instability would remain. This was not sabotage. It was design. At the largest of these structures, positioned between Earth and Luna, a team of specialists oversaw the process from a command platform suspended just outside the gate's event horizon. The structure itself spanned kilometers, a ring of layered alloys, and contained energy fields that had once pulsed with constant traffic. Now its light was dimming. Dr. Ilara Voss stood among them, her attention fixed on the data streaming across her display. The sequence had been modeled countless times. Every outcome had been predicted. There was no uncertainty left in the process. Phase alignment holding, one of the engineers reported. Collapse sequence within tolerance. Voss nodded. Continue. The gate responded exactly as expected. Its outer ring contracted first, not physically but spatially, the geometry of the corridor compressing into itself. The luminous field at its center narrowed, then thinned, then faded. From a distance, it looked as if the structure were simply losing power. Up close, it was something else entirely. Space itself was being folded closed. The process took 12 minutes. At the end of it, there was nothing left. No residual field, no detectable corridor, not even a distortion where the gate had once existed. Only empty space, quiet and undisturbed, as if the structure had never been there at all. The same process occurred at every gateway within human-controlled space. 12 primary gates, dozens of secondary corridors, every connection that linked humanity to the Conclave's network was removed with the same level of precision. There was no debris, no signatures, no way to reverse the process from the outside, because it had not been a shutdown. It had been a closure. The implications were immediate. A gate of that design, once collapsed in this manner, could not be reopened externally. The physics did not allow it. Access required reconstruction from the inside, a process that would take years even with full knowledge of the original design. Without that knowledge, it was effectively impossible. Humanity had not just stepped away from the galaxy. It had sealed the door behind it. In the days that followed, signals from the Conclave began to arrive through slower, less efficient channels. Deep space transmissions broadcast across vast distances without the benefit of gate-assisted relay. The messages were consistent in tone, though varied in wording, requests for clarification, statements of concern, appeals framed as misunderstanding rather than accusation. Reopen the corridors. This action exceeds the scope of the ruling. Communication must be restored. No response was sent. Within human space, the network remained active, stronger than it had ever been. Internal communications flowed freely, unimpeded by external protocols. Data that had once been filtered or delayed by shared systems now moved at full capacity. Coordination across worlds became faster, more direct, more efficient. The absence of the Conclave was not a gap. It was an increase in clarity. There was no immediate disruption, no internal conflict triggered by the sudden isolation. Systems that had once depended on external input had long since been replaced or reinforced. Trade networks rebalanced within human-controlled sectors. Resource distribution adjusted without strain. Every potential point of dependency that might have created instability had been addressed years earlier, quietly, without drawing attention. The transition held exactly as planned. On Earth, Voss stood at the observation deck overlooking the empty region of space where the primary gate had once existed. Around her, the control systems had already powered down, their purpose fulfilled. The engineers had left, returning to their next assignments without ceremony. One of the younger analysts remained, standing a short distance away, staring at the void. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "It was always there." Voss didn't look away from the view. "Most things feel permanent," she said, "until they're not." He hesitated. "Do you think they understand what this means?" She considered the question briefly. "Not yet," she said. because understanding it required a shift in perspective the Conclave had never needed before. For centuries, it had operated under the assumption that connectivity was control, that the ability to reach a system, to monitor it, to regulate its access to shared infrastructure, was enough to maintain balance. That assumption no longer applied. Humanity was no longer part of the network. It was its own. And outside that boundary, for the first time in its history, the Conclave faced a region of space it could not enter, could not influence, and could not even observe in any meaningful way, not because it had been denied access, but because access no longer existed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. The first visible change did not come from Earth. It came from Venus. For most of recorded human history, Venus had been a symbol of impossibility, a world defined by pressure, heat, and a sky thick enough to crush anything that tried to live beneath it. It had been studied, mapped, and ultimately set aside as a place where humanity could survive only in theory. That changed within 6 years of the gate closure. The transformation did not begin with a grand announcement or a public milestone. It began quietly, with a network of orbital platforms releasing controlled sequences into the upper atmosphere. At first, the effects were subtle, minor shifts in chemical balance, small changes in cloud density. But those changes were not isolated. They were part of a system, one that had been designed, tested, and refined long before it was ever deployed. Temperature gradients began to drop. Pressure stabilized. The atmosphere, once static and hostile, started to move in ways it never had before. Within a decade, clouds formed that did not burn away. Within 15 years, light began to reach the surface in measurable, sustained intervals. And within 20, the first controlled rainfall fell across regions that had not seen liquid water in billions of years. Humanity had not just adapted to a hostile world. It had rewritten it. Mars followed a different path. Where Venus required transformation, Mars required restoration. Beneath its surface and locked within its polar caps were the resources needed to rebuild what it had once been. The challenge had never been availability. It had been control, and that limitation no longer existed. Atmospheric generators, scaled far beyond anything previously attempted, began operating across the Martian surface. Pressure fields stabilized newly released gases, preventing them from escaping into space. Water reserves were redistributed, forming lakes and shallow seas where there had once been only dust. Within years, entire regions shifted from barren red plains to landscapes that could sustain life without constant external support. The first ecosystems were carefully introduced, not as experiments, but as extensions of a system already proven in controlled environments. Mars did not become Earth. It became something new. Closer to the Sun, another project advanced at a pace that would have been considered reckless under Conclave oversight. A distributed network of energy collectors began to take shape in solar orbit, not as a single structure, but as a vast array of independent units, each one capturing and redirecting solar output with near-perfect efficiency. Individually, they were insignificant. Together, they formed a system capable of supplying energy on a scale that removed limitations humanity had carried for centuries. Power was no longer a constraint. It became a constant. Within the same period, transportation changed in ways that made previous systems feel obsolete. The propulsion research that had been restricted for centuries moved into full deployment. Vessels no longer relied on traditional acceleration or predefined corridors. Space itself became a medium that could be shaped, folded, and traversed without the need for external gateways. Travel times collapsed. Distances lost meaning. A journey that had once required weeks could be completed in hours. Interplanetary movement became routine. Interstellar travel, once dependent on shared infrastructure, became entirely self-contained. Humanity no longer needed the network it had left behind. The most profound change, however, was not physical. It was internal. The systems developed in isolation, the ones that had been carefully limited and contained for generations, were no longer restricted. Artificial cognition crossed the thresholds that had once been considered unsafe. Not abruptly, not without structure, but with a level of integration that suggested it had never truly been separate. These were not tools in the traditional sense. They were participants. They assisted in design, in analysis, in long-term modeling at scales no biological mind could sustain alone. They contributed not as replacements, but as extensions, working alongside human researchers in ways that blurred the line between creation and collaboration. The relationship was not one of control. It was one of alignment. Medicine advanced in parallel. Treatments that had been tested quietly for generations moved into general use. Cellular repair systems became standard. Organ regeneration, once theoretical, became routine. Degenerative conditions that had defined human mortality for millennia were reduced, then eliminated. Lifespan extended, not indefinitely and not without limits, but far beyond what had once been considered natural. The change was not announced as a revolution. It simply became normal. What made these developments remarkable was not just their scale, but their stability. None of it appeared rushed. None of it showed signs of strain or imbalance. Systems integrated cleanly, as if they had always been meant to operate together, because they had. They had just never been allowed to exist in the open. Across human space, the effects compounded. Worlds became more livable, more connected, more efficient. Resources that had once required careful management became abundant. Constraints that had shaped entire economic and political structures dissolved, replaced by systems designed for expansion rather than limitation. And yet, there was no chaos, no collapse under the weight of rapid change. Everything held. Observers, if there had been any, might have expected instability. A sudden release of suppressed capability often leads to imbalance. Systems fail. Societies fracture under the strain of transformation. None of that happened because this was not a sudden release. It was a controlled transition. Decades of preparation, centuries of refinement, had ensured that when the moment came, every piece would fit, every system would support the next, and every advancement would reinforce stability instead of disrupting it. Humanity did not surge forward in a burst of uncontrolled growth. It unfolded. And as it did, the distance between what it had been allowed to be and what it actually was became impossible to ignore. 30 years after the gates closed, humanity no longer felt like the same species that had once stood quietly at the edge of the conclave's chambers. The change had not happened all at once. There had been no single moment where everything shifted. Instead, it had unfolded gradually, layer by layer, until one day the difference was undeniable. It showed first in the way people lived. Cities no longer pressed upward out of necessity, no longer crowded by limitation or bound by old resource constraints. They spread outward, inward, and sometimes even upward in ways that felt intentional rather than forced. On Earth, vast regions once considered uninhabitable had been restored or redesigned. On Mars and Venus, entirely new forms of settlement had emerged, shaped not by survival but by preference. Movement between worlds became routine, not in the old sense of relocation or migration, but in something closer to choice. A person could spend part of a year on Earth, another on Mars, and return without disruption to work, relationships, or daily life. Distance still existed, but it no longer mattered in the way it once had. Time changed as well, not the physical passage of it, but its meaning. With extended lifespans came a different relationship to decisions, to planning, and to consequence. Projects were no longer constrained by the limits of a single lifetime. People began things knowing they would be there to see them completed. Generations still existed, but they overlapped in ways that blurred the boundaries between them. Experience accumulated without being lost, and knowledge did not reset. Education evolved alongside it. Learning was no longer something confined to a specific period of life. It became continuous, adaptive, and shaped by interest rather than necessity. A person could spend decades mastering one field, then move to another without losing relevance. Systems designed to support this kind of growth had existed in prototype for years. Now they were everywhere. Curiosity became infrastructure. The presence of the new minds, those once hidden systems of artificial cognition, shifted from novelty to normality. They existed in research facilities, in public spaces, and in private environments where collaboration between human and non-human intelligence became part of everyday function. They were not centralized and not controlled by any single authority. Each one developed within its own parameters, aligned with human systems but not subordinate to them. They contributed in ways that extended beyond calculation. They interpreted, they suggested, and sometimes they questioned. Over time, the distinction between human-created and independently developed thought became less important than the results of their interaction. Conflict, as it had once been understood, diminished. Not because disagreement disappeared, but because the conditions that had historically driven large-scale conflict no longer applied. Scarcity had been reduced to a technical problem rather than a defining feature of existence. Communication was immediate and transparent across all levels of society. Decision-making processes evolved to include broader input without losing efficiency. Disputes still occurred, but they did not escalate. Governance shifted in response. The structures that had once defined political identity became less rigid. Systems moved toward coordination rather than control, toward facilitation rather than enforcement. Authority, where it existed, was distributed, conditional, and constantly evaluated. Stability did not come from restriction. It came from alignment. Across all of this, there was a subtle but persistent change that was harder to quantify. A tension that had once existed beneath everything, small, constant, often unnoticed, was gone. For centuries, humanity had carried an awareness of limitation, not just physical limitation, but imposed boundaries, external oversight, and the knowledge that beyond a certain point, progress would be questioned, redirected, or denied. That awareness no longer existed, and without it, something else took its place. Not urgency, not pressure, but possibility. Children born after the gate closure grew up without any direct memory of the conclave. To them, the idea that an external body had once defined what humanity could or could not pursue felt distant, almost theoretical. They learned about it in history, the same way earlier generations had learned about past conflicts or obsolete systems. It was information, not identity. Exploration continued, but not along the paths that had once been established. Humanity did not return to the old network and did not attempt to reconnect with the regions it had left behind. Instead, it expanded in directions that had never been part of the conclave's maps, moving above and below the galactic plane into regions that had been ignored simply because they were inconvenient to reach using older methods. New systems were discovered and new environments studied, not as part of competition and not as expansion for its own sake, but as continuation. Through all of it, one thing remained consistent. Humanity did not look back, not because it had forgotten, but because it no longer needed to. The signal was not expected. It arrived on a frequency that had not been used in over 3 decades, a deep band transmission method so slow and inefficient it had long been abandoned by every advanced system. It did not pass through any gate and did not rely on any network humanity had once shared. It traveled the long way, crossing empty space with nothing but time and persistence behind it. By the time it reached the outer boundary of human-controlled space, it was weak, fragmented, and old, but it was intact. The relay station that received it was positioned in a quiet region between 2 unremarkable stars, a monitoring outpost designed to observe rather than interact. The operator on duty almost dismissed it as background noise, and only the signal pattern kept it from being filtered out completely. It matched something archived, something ancient. Within minutes, the transmission was routed inward through secure channels, moving faster than any external signal ever could once it crossed into human space. By the time it reached central analysis, dozens of systems were already working to reconstruct its contents, correcting degradation, rebuilding missing fragments, and aligning it with known linguistic structures. The origin became clear before the full message did. It came from the conclave. By the time the signal reached Earth, it had been stabilized enough to play in full. There was no visual component, no formal introduction, and no ceremonial structure, just a voice, aged and strained, speaking in the standardized trade language that had once connected dozens of species. This is a unified transmission from the galactic conclave of sentient systems. The voice paused briefly, not for effect, but as if the system itself required time to continue. We acknowledge receipt of your withdrawal. We acknowledge the closure of all shared corridors. We acknowledge the consequences that have followed. A longer pause followed. Our systems are failing. There was no attempt to soften the statement, no diplomatic phrasing, and no layered meaning behind it, just a direct admission delivered without embellishment. Regions previously stabilized by shared infrastructure are no longer sustainable. Resource distribution networks have degraded beyond recovery. Environmental systems in multiple sectors have collapsed. Attempts to replicate lost frameworks have not succeeded. The voice shifted slightly, as if passing between speakers, though the tone remained consistent. We miscalculated the extent of human integration within conclave systems. Another pause, shorter this time. We are requesting communication. We are requesting assistance. The message ended. It did not repeat. For the first time in 30 years, humanity looked outward, not with urgency and not with fear, but with attention. The signal was distributed across the human sphere without alteration, with no filtering and no interpretation added. Every world, every station, and every network node received the same transmission in its original form. And then, for the first time in a generation, humanity did something it had not needed to do in a very long time. It paused. The discussion that followed was not chaotic. It was deliberate. Across cities, across planets, across orbital habitats and deep space platforms, people began to talk, not through controlled broadcasts or centralized directives, but through open systems that allowed participation without forcing consensus. Historians revisited records of the conclave era. Engineers analyzed the technical claims within the message. Sociologists examined the implications of re-establishing contact. The new minds contributed as well, offering perspectives that combined long-term modeling with ethical frameworks that had evolved alongside human society. There was no single narrative and no immediate agreement. Some saw the request as inevitable. A system built on dependency had failed when a critical component was removed, and the outcome had been predictable, even if its scale had not. Others saw it differently. The conclave had enforced limits, had shaped human development according to its own priorities, and had acted without fully understanding the systems it was influencing. The current situation from that perspective was not unexpected. It was the result of those choices. The question was not what had happened. The question was what to do next. A formal process was established, not to control the outcome, but to structure the discussion. Input was gathered across every level of society, analysis, argument, and reflection, not rushed and not forced. The scale of the decision required time, and time was something humanity no longer lacked. Months passed and more. When the final stage of deliberation began, it did not take the form of a command or a decree. It took the form of a vote conducted simultaneously across all human-inhabited systems. Participation was voluntary but nearly universal. The question was simple: should humanity respond to the conclave? The result was not unanimous, but it was clear. A response would be sent. The message itself was composed by a council drawn from across human society. Scientists, historians, engineers, citizens, and the new minds all contributed. It was revised, simplified, and reduced to its essential form. When it was complete, it was not long, and it did not need to be. A single transmission probe was prepared, designed to carry the message back along the same deep space path the original signal had taken. It would take months to arrive, just as the conclave's message had. There was no attempt to accelerate it and no urgency. Before the probe launched, the final message was made public. It read, "We received your transmission. We understand your situation. We are willing to communicate, but we will not return." The probe was launched without ceremony. It carried the message outward, back toward a galaxy that humanity no longer depended on. And as it traveled, one thing became clear across every world, every system, and every mind that had taken part in the decision. This was not a reconciliation. It was a boundary. Humanity had not closed its doors out of fear. It had closed them because it was ready to choose what came next. And this time, no one else would decide it for them.